Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks. A study that was brought to my attention this week was related to a recent publication that pointed out that you can have improvements in cardiovascular health, you can have improvements in blood pressure by simply adding 5 additional minutes per day to your everyday activities, doing 5 minutes of exercise each day without the indication of the relative level of intensity of that exercise or how demanding the exercise might be relative to what you're normally doing in your everyday activities? Or is it simply just doing 5 more minutes of your regular everyday activities? Are the authors telling us something that we've previously discussed in terms of not needing exorbitant amounts of time of exercise in order to see improvements? Or are they simply looking at this in terms of providing us a statistical pipe dream? A thing that is real in statistics, but is not really real when we start looking at how the human body works. Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
What the study is really looking at, and what we talk about when we start looking at how exercise might impact blood pressure, how much exercise might impact cardiovascular health, is rooted in the changes that can take place to your cardiorespiratory, cardiopulmonary system when doing exercise. There is a lot of anecdotes, there's a lot of personal stories, personal recommendations that indicate that we need so much exercise in a day in order to improve health. The general recommendation that we get as it relates to changes of blood pressure, changes of cardiovascular health with exercise is that recommendation of 90 minutes of high intensity exercise or 150 minutes of moderate activity per week. If we look at that in terms of number of minutes per week and divide it by the number of days in the week, that's the indication that we should be doing high intensity exercise somewhere between 10 and say 15 minutes a day, and moderate activities somewhere around 20 to 25 minutes a day. Those minutes are additive minutes, which means that we don't have to do them all in one lump sum, nor is it an indication that we have to exercise continuously on each day. There are benefits that come about from doing exercise on every day. There is benefit that comes about by periodizing your exercise, as we've discussed previously. The idea that is being presented in this new article and is kind of causing some contention amongst a lot of the cardiologists and amongst a lot of the other researchers that have looked at this idea about exercise medicine and the utilization of lifestyle changes in an attempt to improve cardiorespiratory and cardiopulmonary health is that it's indicating two distinct things that come about in terms of changes to the diastolic pressure and the systolic pressure. And they're different in terms of the benefits that we see coming out from the study that is most recently released. Study is currently being released, pre-release in terms of early release for people to read before it's actually published in print in the Journal of Circulation, which is the Journal of the American Heart Association. And what they looked at is they were actually looking at devices that were measuring movements and movement-like behaviors over a 24-hour period of time and comparing those devices to how it relates to changes in measured blood pressure. So they weren't really looking at what was the individual doing in terms of a prescription. They were simply doing a tracking study. So when we start looking at tracking studies, we have to kind of take results with a bit of a grain of salt because we don't know specifically what the individuals are doing, how the individuals are progressing. We're simply looking at what is happening in a tracking, in a logbook style response to the intervention that is taking place. And there wasn't really any intervention. The intervention that was being used was simply looking at them, the individuals within the study that they were tracking, following normally prescribed behaviors. That is, we generally have the general recommendation of that 90 minutes per week, the 150 minutes per week of high intensity or moderate intensity exercise in terms of what the individual should be doing in an attempt to improve cardiorespiratory health. The cohorts that they looked at, the groupings that they looked at was based off of how active the individuals were within those 24 hours based off of the movement devices that they were looking at. So once again, they weren't looking at specific types of interventions. They were looking at if they did, say, interval training versus Gabata training versus slow, steady intensity training or steady state intensity training. They weren't looking at any of those factors. They're simply looking at relative movement versus relative in movement or non-movement. And we get estimates coming out of this cohort. And the thing with the cohort that we have to look at here in terms of the population is that it was a rather large population. So they did have power in terms of what they were looking at in terms of the population. But the means by which they looked at it kind of leads us to have to question some of the conclusions that they were drawing in terms of what can be clinically significant for us to take away from. And what can we take away from the study here is that as a public health perspective, encouraging individuals to be active is still paramount in terms of the target for lifestyle interventions as it relates to cardiovascular health. That dieting alone is not going to cause, or changes in diets, I should say, is not going to cause significant changes in cardiovascular and cardiorespiratory health or improvements in blood pressure. However, utilizing exercise or exercise-like activities combined with normal everyday activities seems to have improvements that go beyond just doing normal increases in normal physical activity. Where when we look at the difference between rest or sleep, sedentary behaviors, standing behaviors, slow or fast walking behaviors, or even doing exercise. When we start combining all of those factors into what's going on with our treatments, what we're able to do is we're able to look at how total activity is more important than the specific types of activity or the duration of those specific types of activity. That is kind of the real take-home message that's not being portrayed within the news stories that are coming out from this article, or that is causing a little bit of a kerfuffle within some of the researchers who are being quoted within the news articles, or that are responding to the pre-press or the pre-release article coming out of the journal Circulation. Because high blood pressure, because hypertension is a complex issue, very similar to all the other complex issues that we look at when we look at any type of metabolic issue, we can't say that doing one specific behavioral adaptation is going to cause a reduction in the complexity that's going to lead to some sort of health resolution. Lifestyle changes and the way in which lifestyle changes work is that by doing small changes of behaviors towards pro-health behaviors, towards behaviors that are better, quotes on that, better for you to do, lead to changes in other health behaviors. And so what is coming out from the study here is not the fact that, just as simple as 5 minutes or 10 minutes of daily exercise is what's necessary. What it's indicating is that additional 5 or 10 minutes of exercise acts as a stimulant to other pro-health behaviors that one will take on so as to lead to a better pro-health lifestyle. And so what was actually taken out? What was the takeaway messages in terms of the results that we see in this study? Well, first off, the majority of the individuals that we're looking at here are older in terms of age, and all of them have elevated systolic and diastolic pressure. So the average systolic and diastolic pressure that was reported within the study was about 130-ish over 80. So we're at a borderline hypertensive labeling in terms of the most current American Heart Association labels. The average age was around 55, with a very broad range of age within that. About a quarter of the population was taking some sort of medication, which is where we have to take a step back in terms of what we can glean from that as a healthy population, or as a population that's trying to use lifestyle interventions as a means to control changes or to offset changes independent of taking any medication. We had in terms of the demographics of the individuals, we're looking at about a 47% sampling between females and males, 52% female, 47% male, which if you look at most of the medical research is actually pretty good, because we generally don't get that close of a gender breakdown in terms of evenness of distribution in between the two socially recognized genders. In terms of other demographics that have been known to have differential responses in terms of health and behavior responses, looking at education, looking at socioeconomic conditions, socioeconomic categorizations, about half of the population that was studied had at least some level of higher education. About half of the population was middle and upper class in terms of socioeconomic status. And so that becomes important, because we know that those who are more educated and those who are more affluent tend to use more behaviors, more pro-health behaviors, more pro-health lifestyle behaviors than those who are of lower socioeconomic status or have not had as much education. And that goes into means and opportunity to participate in lifestyle behaviors that are pro-health, as well as having specific environmental conditions and environmental cues that are more conducive to having pro-health lifestyles. In terms of the level of activity that we see within the individuals, one of the things that was noted within the changes of behavior was that while swapping activity-like behaviors, exercise-like behaviors, or just being physically active in place of sedentary behaviors showed to have the ability to reduce diastolic pressure, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1 millimeter of mercury pressure. That'd be one number on the dial for diastolic pressure. Was estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10 minutes of fast walking time in place of about 11 minutes of sedentary time. But we also see an improvement in diastolic pressure with sleeping, where about 13 minutes of additional sleeping leads to an improvement in diastolic pressure. Same thing happens with 14 minutes of slow walking. But there's a problem here, is that the substantial reduction in sedentary behavior beyond the baseline average is necessary in order to see a subsequent change. And so just because we start talking about, okay, 10 minutes of fast walking, or 10 minutes of doing 14 or 15 minutes of doing slow walking, or even 13 minutes of additional sleeping in place of the 10 to 11 minutes of sedentary time, is going to lead to that 1 millimeter mercury pressure. Or if we look at other findings in here, where if we replace any of the non-activity behaviors with 5 minutes of exercise-like activity, if we replace 5 minutes of sedentary behavior with exercise-like activity, we can see about a 0.5 millimeter mercury pressure reduction with a significant confidence interval. That means the confidence interval that's always favoring the reduction in blood pressure. But no 5-minute reallocations of any other pairing seem to have any type of significant changes, which means that adding additional exercise to the additional activity you're already doing is not going to have an additive benefit. It's about the lump sum total of time, not the difference that we're going to see in the type of activity that we're doing. But what we do have to do is we do have to see a subsequent change in the amount of time spent in sedentary behaviors relative to the amount of time spent exercising in order to see any type of this significant change in blood pressure. which means simply adding exercise to what you're already doing without adding additional time to what you're doing, is not going to have the benefits that are being reported within the news as relates to diastolic pressure. That's the pressure on the relaxation side of the ventricles contracting within the heart. There's a little bit different story being told with the systolic pressure here, which is a little bit more important when we start looking at the hypertension numbers that we see within the population, where we start seeing additional responses to the exercising based off of the systolic blood pressure changes that we do not see with the diastolic pressure changes, which means that we might see a gain in benefit from doing movement on the systolic side that we do not necessarily see on the diastolic side of our blood pressure. And that can be important. And that's because the greatest amount of contraction and contraction strength that has to be generated and the greatest amount of strain and stress being placed on the heart is during that systolic side of the contraction, in terms of having to generate enough strength within the heart to overcome the pressure within the blood vessels to get the blood to move. And this is where we start seeing changes that can take place in the systolic pressures with those who have greater amounts of sleep, with those that have greater changes in exercise, where they have a high load of exercise, not necessarily a high intensity of exercise. And once again, this is where we have to kind of look at what can be offered from the results of the study, even though we're looking at a quite large population. The number in the population of the study is about 15,000 individuals that were being tracked, is that they weren't looking at the intensity of the exercise, they were looking at the duration of the exercise. And so we see significant improvements in 10 to 20 minutes of exercise for both systolic and diastolic in terms of adaptations of the pressure waves that we see within the populations being studied, where the indication from other studies have indicated that working somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 45 minutes per exercise session per day at a moderate level of intensity is going to provide significant improvements in blood pressure. And by significant improvements in blood pressure, we're talking about greater than what is being reported here. So for the 20 to 30 minute groups, we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 millimeters of mercury pressure on the systolic side and 2 to 4 millimeters of mercury pressure on the diastolic side, relative to what is being seen here with about a 1 millimeter mercury pressure on the diastolic side, and about the same on the systolic side, with a little bit of a bigger range on the confidence interval on the systolic side relative to the diastolic side. And so if we start looking at this in terms of clinical significance, what most cardiologists are looking at in terms of meaningful improvement is looking at a reduction of about 2 millimeters of mercury pressure on the systolic side, about 1 millimeter of mercury pressure on the diastolic side. And so we're not seeing that clinical significant change on the systolic side and the diastolic side, with the estimates coming out of the analysis from the authors stipulating that systolic improvements are going to come about from about 20 to 27 minutes of exercise, whereas diastolic improvements are going to come between 10 and 15 minutes of additional exercise. That is, exercise is going to be time that's reallocated from the sedentary behaviors. It's not where we're adding additional activities. We're simply adding time that would be used in either standing or other sedentary behaviors, and we're reallocating that time to doing exercise. Once again, without indications for what that exercise happens to be. And so what can we say about what's the take-home message that we can get? So what does the conclusions that are being offered from the analysis from the authors in this article that is out in press right now? It's about the total time of exercise, not necessarily about what exercise you're doing. It's about reallocating time that would be sedentary to being active. It's not necessarily an indication that standing is any better than other sedentary behaviors as relates to modifications of systolic or diastolic pressure, blood pressures in general. And it's not an indication that we're off in terms of what is generally sought as the recommendations for level of activity in order to improve blood pressures for people who have hypertension already. We can go back and we can look at, okay, what are the physiological rationale? What is the anatomical rationale for doing this? And we'll go back and we'll revisit the previous discussion that we've had about what actually happens to the heart, what actually happens to the blood vessels, what actually happens to the blood when I'm physically active. And this is where we have to take into account the timing of exercise and the general level of intensity of exercise. That is, how energetically demanding is the exercise relative to how much movement am I doing? That is when we're looking at the relative intensity. We can look at it in terms of how close am I taking myself to my aerobic capacity? How close am I taking to my anaerobic capacity in terms of the physiological responses we're going to get to exercise? And when we start looking at those factors within the guise of this latest article, there's no modifications, no changes to what is being recommended in terms of total time of exercise or the intensity that we should be working at in terms of anaerobic or aerobic thresholds and what can come about. When we do exercise, when we are physically active, and what most of the cardiologists and what most of the articles looking at hypertension are doing is looking at it in terms of endurance style exercise. They're not really looking at the resistance exercise or the interval exercises that mimic resistance exercise in terms of working and functioning within the anaerobic metabolic capacities of the individual. They're really looking at in terms of the endurance side of exercise. A side of exercise, a side of activity that I think we really need to focus on here, as it's not that we are somehow going to simply get benefits from doing 5 minutes or 10 minutes of exercise. It's the fact that we're doing additional minutes of exercise. We're doing additional minutes of endurance exercise, fast walking, slow walking, in terms of what's going on for their overall level of activity taking place. Where the majority of the individuals, the average plus within the confidence intervals of exercise, are doing somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2 to 2.5 hours of physical activity already. 2 to 2.5 hours of slow or fast walking. That puts them into that range of minimum amount of exercise that is expected of someone following a lifestyle intervention for people with hypertension issues, people who are attempting to use lifestyle to combat pathology within their cardiovascular system, pathology within their heart, pathology within their blood vessels, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. So it's not that just simply doing 5 to 10 minutes or 10 to 20 minutes of exercise each day is going to be the benefit. It's that additional side to it. And so they're not really telling us that we have to do X amount of exercise, Y amount of time. What they're simply indicating within this article is that we have to basically switch or add to or take from the sedentary time that we're having each day and put it into the exercise time that we're having each day or throughout the week in terms of that total amount of time. But without indicating what we should be doing in terms of the type of exercise. Whether endurance exercise is better than resistance exercise, or the fact that a lot of the recommendations for exercise that are coming to the individuals who have cardiovascular disease, that have hypertension, that have heart disease, a lot of the recommendations are coming from ideologies and some faulty ideals about what is safe and what is not safe for someone with hypertension as relates to post-exertional hypotensive changes and how post-exertional hypotensive changes can have a deleterious effect on the individual. One of the things that we pointed out in our articles as it relates to the use of resistance training for treating overfatness issues, metabolic issues, which is going to include cardiorespiratory changes, is that resistance exercise has a better effectiveness, a higher effect size than endurance exercise by itself. Combining resistance exercise and endurance exercise tends to have the greatest impact on systolic pressure and diastolic pressure, seems to have the greatest impact on aerobic fitness, as it causes multiple metabolic and multiple kinematic changes to take place within the heart and within the blood vessels. What we're trying to do with exercise is we're trying to cause temporary changes in the pressure that the heart has to exert in order to move blood through the body based on changes in where blood is flowing through the body. What the change in blood flow through the body is doing is causing changes in the way in which the blood vessels are going to function that will lead to changes in a phenomenon known as compliance. That is the ability for the blood vessels to stretch and return back to its normal capacity. That change in compliance leads to an easement on the heart contraction that leads to a partial reduction in total peripheral resistance. And by reducing total peripheral resistance, we're able to have a more efficient heart stroke, a more efficient heart contraction, a more efficient ventricular contraction. That is the contraction within the heart, within the atria and ventricle contractions that take place within the heart in order to move blood through the body. The more efficient the heart is able to contract, the more blood it's able to move with each beat, the more blood will be moving through the body and the more blood that will be moving back to the heart. The other thing that happens when we are more physically active, regardless of what type of physical activity we happen to have, is an increase in blood volume. The more we exercise, the more blood we will actually have, and the more blood the heart will be able to move with each beat and over each minute. What is referred to as cardiac output. So what is happening is that as we're more active, we're going to get more cardiac output. As we're more active, we're going to start seeing changes in the anatomy of the heart. The actual shape of the heart will change. The heart will elongate. It will become larger. That largeness is going to allow for greater volumes of blood to be moved. Whereas if we are less active, we're not going to see an elongation of the heart, but we're going to start seeing a more muscular heart, a hypertrophied heart that's going to reduce the volumes that are going to be moved within each heartbeat. And so as we are more active, that heart elongates, the heart becomes larger to accommodate for greater volumes being moved. That's going to allow for a stronger contraction to take place without needing greater muscle action, greater muscular action within the heart, which allows for greater volumes to be moved with each beat, which allows for better fluid flow through the blood vessels, through the arteries. That better fluid flow leads to better compliance. That leads to a reduction in the blood pressures. And this is how we're able to get the change in blood pressure by utilizing changes in lifestyle, by increasing physical activity. The more physically active we are, the higher level of intensity of exercise is necessary in order to see adaptations taking place. However, the more physically active we are, the better we are at having those changes remain if we stay active. We don't have to constantly be increasing the level of activity within our exercise in order to have the improvements remain. However, if we're looking at maximizing the improvements that we can get, we have to maximize the intensities of exercises that we're utilizing within the periodization of programs so as to ensure that we have continuous progression with the acknowledgement that we're going to have an 8 to 12 week window of time where we're going to have continual adaptations taking place, where if we do not change the training methods and the training modalities, we're going to start seeing plateauing of the responses. That doesn't mean that the responses stop. It simply means that the rate of change that we see slows down. And as with everything else, it's in an exponential curve, which means that we're not going to see it go to zero, but we're going to see it start to flatten out in terms of the slope of the line of change, which means that as we start to see changes start to regress or start seeing changes to slow down, we have to change the methods by which we are training, the intensities by which we are exercising, so that we're able to continuously have modifications, continuously have adaptations. This is where we also have to look at what is going to be the self-selected, self-monitored behaviors for the individuals, not the coercive behaviors for the individuals. People who have metabolic issues tend to have self-selection towards specific type of exercises, whereas individuals that do not have metabolic conditions tend to have different types of self-selection towards exercises. People who have metabolic pathologies, people who are overweight, overfat, people who have cardiovascular disease, people who have metabolic disease, they respond to exercise quite differently than other individuals. they actually subjectively feel exercise to be different than other individuals. This is where we have to take into account those factors. We start looking at, okay, how much time, how much effort needs to go into the exercise in order to see improvements taking place. And this is why we have to, whenever we look at these articles that say, oh, just 5 more minutes, oh, just 10 minutes, oh, just this, oh, just that, in terms of getting these great benefits, we have to take a step back and take a look at, okay, what is the physiological principle? What is the anatomical basis for having these responses take place? And when it comes to this article about all you need is 10 minutes or you can get benefits from 5 minutes, the article's title that was sent to me basically stated that an extra 5 minutes of daily exercise helps lower blood pressure. And that's not what the study stated. What the person that is giving us this news article is giving us is not necessarily the take-home message. The take-home message from the article was that you can see, based off of analysis of movement behaviors, not the analysis of exercise, a within range benefit for clinical improvement on diastolic pressure alone, based off of that 5 minutes of exercise. As long as the 5 minutes of exercise is a replacement for 10 minutes plus of sedentary behavior. The indication that we have in terms of this lifestyle intervention, as well as all the other lifestyle interventions, is that small changes lead to big changes. As the statement goes, it's the little things we do that allow for big things to be possible. And that's what's taking place here. Small changes, small additive steps in terms of our everyday physical activity can lead to improvements in cardiovascular health. We can actually get better cardiovascular health improvements by utilizing resistance exercise or a combination of endurance and resistance exercise in a periodized, planned out, progressive exercise regimen than simply doing the increased amount of walking time that was seen within the tracking of the exercise. And this is the other thing we have to worry about when we start looking at these tracking studies when it comes to exercise. Most of the tracking studies that are looking at exercises are not actually going to equate resistance exercise as having benefit because they're looking at in terms of the faulty caloric balance issue that we've previously discussed, or the fact that we're not getting high enough and continuously high enough changes in cardiometabolic responses. So they discount the benefit they get from resistance exercise, even though if we look at it in terms of the meta-analytical studies, as it relates to metabolic issues coming about from sedentary people becoming active, resistance exercise has a better benefit and is more effective than endurance exercise, with the combination of the two exercises being more beneficial than resistance exercise, which is more beneficial than endurance exercise, even though endurance exercise is what is generally being recommended to these individuals. And so when we start looking at how to go about utilizing this information for making better choices in our life, being more pro-health, what is the take-home message? The take-home message is to make sure you're getting your minimum recommended amount of exercise each week. If you can, swap 5 to 10 minutes of sedentary behaviors, whether it is sitting or standing, with being physically active or doing exercise-like behaviors, which is their definition of doing slow walking or fast walking, swapping out the sedentary behaviors with physical activity or exercise-like behaviors for at least 5 to 10 minutes will have benefits on diastolic pressure. At least 20 minutes will have benefit on systolic pressure. If we go back and look at the fitness and fatness examinations that we've done in our meta-analytical studies, as well as the benefits that we saw in our yo-yoers, where we did 2 years of continuous progressive periodized exercise, we know that combination of resistance and endurance exercise is much more important in terms of metabolic health, in terms of physiological health, in terms of cardiorespiratory health, in terms of musculoskeletal health, than simply being active or doing endurance exercise. Well, thanks for joining. Hopefully get a bit out of the conversation as it relates to what did this latest article tell us about the improvements that can come about in terms of cardiorespiratory health with simply adding a few minutes of exercise each day. If you like what we put out there, please make sure you're giving us a big thumbs up, give us that 5-star rating. Make sure you're following us here on the podcast as well as on YouTube, the written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes that we post onto Instagram and onto Threads. Please make sure you're sharing out with all of your friends and family. If you have questions, comments, or concerns about any of the information that we're presenting, please make sure you leave comments to us. We're more than happy to address them in future conversations as we have on the podcast or presentations that we'll have on the YouTube channel or written stuff that we'll put into Substack. Please stay tuned for more information out there as it relates to covering all of the misconceptions that we have about how the human body works or any of the latest information we have about how we can go about being healthier.